Welcome, everybody. How are we doing? All right. Hello, thank you for being here today. My name is Susan Yaki, and I'm the director of the La Follette School of Public Affairs here at UW-Madison. It's my great privilege to kick things off with for this event featuring both Chancellor Jennifer Mnookin and Greg Lukianoff, President and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. I know we're all excited to see this conversation. Today's presentation is made possible between a partnership with La Follette as well as the Chancellor's Office. It's part of UW-Madison's Wisconsin Exchange Initiative, which aims to put pluralism into practice by helping students, faculty, staff, and the wider community engage, live, and lead in a polarized world. Additionally, special thanks go out to our other event sponsors, including the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership, the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy, and the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy. La Follette's thrilled to be participating in this Wisconsin Exchange event because promoting civil dialogue is something that is very near and dear to us. As some of you may know, La Follette is officially launching its new undergraduate major in public policy, the first of its kind in Wisconsin, this upcoming fall. The program will be distinct from other public policy undergraduate programs across the country in that its curriculum will focus on civil dialogue, working across differences, and finding common ground. And this is just the latest in our ongoing efforts to promote civil dialogue. Since 2022, our Main Street Agenda events have brought folks across the state together to talk about the issues that matter to them, as well as to practice civility and constructive dialogue. Like the Chancellor, we believe that it's more important than ever to talk and to listen to each other, especially when we disagree. In fact, it's precisely when we disagree that we ought to be engaging with each other. We know that there will be uncomfortable conversations, but it's actually largely because we're out of practice having those uncomfortable conversations. According to a Pew survey, 77% of Americans report having few or no friends who have different political beliefs than them. One of our 2024 Main Street Agenda participants from Eau Claire summed it up this way. He said, quote, "I think people are starved to give their input. People feel that they don't have an outlet to do this outside of their own little circles, which these days are smaller than ever." Social media and information echo chambers are the common scapegoats for the modern era of polarization and incivility, but there are many culprits that have helped to drive us more apart in recent decades. Today's guest, Greg Lukianoff, is an ideal person to tease out some of those other causes. Over the course of Greg's very impressive career, he's become one of the nation's leading voices on the importance of free speech for all. And he has traced some of today's issues with polarization to the well-intentioned chipping away of free speech on college campuses and in society more broadly. His 2018 New York Times bestselling book, The Coddling of the American Mind, argued that sheltering college students from difficult and even dangerous ideas contributed to a fragility that harmed both individuals and America's democracy. He has continued to take passionate and principled stances in defense of free speech through op-eds, essays, TV appearances, and yes, even more books. He is nothing if not prolific. He ended an excellent TED Talk last year by arguing, quote, "To understand the world, it's crucial to know what people really think. And that is not going to happen in a situation in which people feel that they cannot be their authentic selves. And for that, we need free speech." Here to tell us what they really think, please help me welcome Greg Lukianoff and Chancellor Jennifer Mnookin.
Well, thank you, Susan, and a big thanks to the La Follette School for helping to make this event possible. And hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for what I know is going to be a lively and interesting conversation about free expression on campus and broader questions as well with Greg Lukianoff. Thank you so much for being with us. We're really, really happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me. And I did want to say that this is my father's alma mater. The University of Wisconsin-Madison is what actually brought my dad to this country. And it's very cute to hear him say in his Russian accent, "Go Badgers."
That speech we can all agree with. That's good. So this event's also part of our new Wisconsin Exchange Initiative, which is focused on promoting vigorous dialogue and debate on campus across backgrounds, viewpoints, identities, religions, political perspectives, and ideas. And so it's really hard to imagine a more perfect place to discuss issues like that than in our city, named in honor of James Madison, the founding father responsible for enshrining freedom of speech in the Constitution. And these are issues close to many of our hearts. As many of you know, I'm not a First Amendment expert. Greg is. I am a law professor, so we'll try not to get too law nerdy on you as we discuss. And I think probably all of you are well aware of the plaque on the front of Bascom Hall and its famous language about fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone truth can be found. And that requires dialogue, inquiry, debate, and sometimes even being confronted with ideas we find disagreeable or offensive. At the same time, we need universities to be places where people can learn and where people can have enough scaffolding that they can learn effectively. And so one of the challenges is how do we do all of that at once? We already got a huge number of questions from many of you submitted in advance, and I will be asking a number of those. Toward the end of our time together, I'll also be asking if some of you want to write questions down. They'll be handed up to me, and I will aim to ask some of those as well. So that's going to be our order of operations. And again, welcome. I guess I want to start by just asking a little bit more about your personal story and what got you this interested in speech and the First Amendment. How did that happen?
Do you have 4 hours? Yeah, I mean, the dad I just mentioned, my grandfather, not my my dad turns 100 in April. So he was born in 1926 in Zagreb. His father had just fled because what had just become the Soviet Union, because we fought in the Bolshevik Revolution and we lost. We liked the Mensheviks, and we lost. And so I grew up, and then my dad was there during Nazi occupation in Yugoslavia. So my dad got kicked out of high school for opposing the Nazis because that was during the occupation. And he was at a Russian military school, and he remembers the head of the school saying, because my dad had been caught saying things opposing the Nazis, and it's like, I have the lives of 120 kids to think of, and that always gave me chills, because it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, people in America sometimes didn't get it. It's like, no, they were Slavs. They would kill us, without thinking about it. So I grew up with a very strong sense of anti-authoritarianism. I sometimes think it's so hardwired. It's the same reason why, when I go to sports, games and that kind of stuff, I feel uncomfortable anything where there's that much agreement. when everyone's cheering together, I'm like, I don't know.
So disagreement is your happy place. Okay.
Yeah. But it's lack of certainty. Right. There's something about, it's one of the reasons why I love David Bowie. That's a theme all throughout his music. So I grew up in the suburbs of New York City, and I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of other immigrant kids and a lot of other first-generation kids. And a lot of those kids were fleeing authoritarianism as well, or totalitarianism in China, for example. So, and it was the 80s. So there was a lot of sort of there is something really special about this idea of freedom of speech. Make it even worse, I was a student journalist in undergrad. I got really radicalized about the Communications Decency Act, where they actually tried to ban indecency on the internet. see how that worked? Not so hot. And that's what made me want to go to law school. I went to law school to do First Amendment law. I took every class that Stanford Law School offered on First Amendment. And when I ran out, I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty. And if you want to know what you're meant to do in life, I remember telling one of my really good friends that I was doing the 6-credit project on censorship in the Tudor dynasty. He said, "Who's making you do that?" And I'm like, "I made the project. I'm very excited about it." And when you realize that there's something that you love that much that other people don't even understand, maybe you should do that for the rest of your life. And so FIRE actually found me, thanks to Kathleen Sullivan, the former dean of the law school, who's a friend of the Chancellor's. And I've been doing that now for almost 25 years.
That's a great origin story. That's really powerful. So free speech is something that many people believe in some of the time.
Yes.
And there's an awful lot of free speech for me, but not for thee.
You don't say.
Indeed. What is the elevator pitch that you like to use for trying to get people to understand why free speech is so important, especially when it's actually really uncomfortable, when it's not easy?
I guess it depends on who's in the elevator.
Fair enough.
I think that they opened up with some of my quotes from my TED Talk, which is probably my best distillation of kind of like my elevator pitch for free speech, but it's still a 12-minute pitch. That's a long elevator ride.
Get stuck in the elevator briefly.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Yes, right.
But I do come back to epistemology about like how we actually know things. And you cannot really know things with all the limitations of how we learn things and how we understand what's true without freedom of speech, but from two different directions. One of them is that there's this whole idea of conjectures and refutations from Karl Popper, that essentially you say something, you have a conjecture, and then you learn not through figuring out what's true, but by figuring out what's not true. That's the scientific method. We don't really figure out what's true. We figure out a probability cloud around what might be true, and we do that through subtraction. You never really actually get into that cloud. You never actually know forever like what's true within it. You just know what isn't, and that cannot happen if you're not allowed to dissent. Dissent is essential for understanding the world as it is. But I go further, and that's the fact that you have ideas in your head, that you have inclinations, that you have opinions, that you have aversions. This is some of the most important data, some of the most important information in the world. And then this makes me an old-fashioned humanist. I think humans are the most interesting thing in the world to study, and everything about a human being is worth knowing. And it's incredibly important, and not just when we're right about stuff. It's almost more important, especially when we're wrong. Bad ideas, misconceptions run the world. We have all sorts of misconceptions right now. The only problem is we don't know what they are. And we're going to find out later, and believe me, your kids and grandkids are going to tell you. So I do think that it's key to understanding the world. And then, of course, to get back to James Madison, you don't really have a democratic society if you can't actually dissent, flat out. So for the shortest one, where I feel like people don't really know anything about it, there's that temptation to have Ira Glasser, who's on our advisory council, who's the former executive director of the ACLU. He would explain it. It seems really tempting to want to punish the bad opinions or ignorant opinions of your enemy. But that's a tool that works like poison gas. You think you're destroying your enemy with it, but then the wind changes direction and it blows back at you. And the idea that they will use that against you in the future, to me, is not, I don't like that argument as much because it's not as principled, but it is also has the benefit of being true. That essentially, if you care about your free speech, then you need to defend everybody's free speech. But I think it goes even deeper into, I also believe in fundamental human rights, that essentially we should consider certain things to simply attach to people as a matter of principle, as a matter of morality. And one of those rights is your opinion, your ability to tell your story. So.
That was a pretty good elevator speech. Thank you for that. I guess I'd like to make it concrete around FIRE. So FIRE, for a period of time, was taking heat probably more from the left than the right for its regular criticism of some of what was happening, including on college campuses, where there was coddling from your perspective, or there was a reluctance to have robust engagement, especially in spaces that felt like that was going to cause a sense of harm or discomfort to people from more marginalized communities.
Yeah.
Now you're taking some heat from the right for your protection of speech coming out of left-leaning perspectives that is under attack. How does that feel? I mean, like, I'm a lawyer, I like meta principles. Like, I'm a big fan of trying to figure out what is it that you think the rules should be, whether the folks in power are the ones you would choose or the ones you're kind of afraid of. And so I like that you are engaged in an effort to have meta principles about these. But what does that mean for your organization?
It's a hard way to live, and I understand why most organizations don't. And I remember actually.
Is that characterization fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We used to take a lot of heat from the left as if we never fought the right, and we've been fighting the right since day one. Just particularly since we were focused on campus first, there tended to be more threats from the left. However, under the current administration, we get a new threat from Trump, every couple of days. Some days multiple in a single day. And obviously, we never have and never would stand for that either. It is a little bit. I do think we have gotten worse overall. I'm not one of these people. Like, there's this kind of like simplification sometimes that people like to use to kind of dismiss some of the arguments about the state of free speech by saying, well, there never was a perfect golden age of free speech. And I'm always like, nobody's arguing that there was. But we'd be silly to argue that we weren't better about a lot of these things previously. And certainly even 15 years ago, it was more common to have the old refrain, I hate what they say, but I defend to my death the right to say it, for people you disagreed with. That was, to a degree, kind of taken for granted, and it was one of the things that made America kind of weird. It was one of the things that made my little, immigrant and first generation community so proud of us. This is not the way it works in most countries. And I do think we've gotten worse, that now it definitely seems like, yeah, that person should be punished, but my side shouldn't be, is almost treated as kind of like a normal argument, as opposed to an immoral kind of argument to people like us. And in terms of running an organization, if you want to make money in a nonprofit, go partisan, by all means. Like, that's the easy way to make money. I've said this for ages. I could have had a $100 million organization 15 years ago if I decided to be hard partisan, and I could have chosen to go right or left. And you can make a ton of money that way. It is much harder to be willing to lose donors, to take flack, to actually just have to work a lot harder because you're going to be angering those people the next year. Now, so for this year, I have spent, as you can tell, I like writing, I like thinking, I like all of the kind of more professorial parts of the job more. But I've spent an awful lot of this last year fundraising because there are people who loved us when we were taking on, forgive the expression, wokeness, but don't love it when we're taking on MAGA. And so it's harder to find the people who just get it in their bones, who get it as a principle, and that just takes a lot more work. So I've had a lot of colds this year from way too much business travel.
Let's walk back to your book of 8 years ago, The Cuddling of the American Mind, which Susan also...
Oh, I should make a point. I have actually always hated the title of that book.
Oh.
Yeah. And I don't actually... I fought it really hard when they first decided to give us this title at The Atlantic, but John Haidt, my co-author, disagreed with me. Now, to be fair, I wanted the much more boring arguing towards misery, because, which, nobody would have read. So that's fair.
Right.
But when we did the book, I was like, but no way in hell is this thing going to be called Coddling in the American Mind. Because that's not my point. And we sold the contract under the name Disempowered. Because what I wanted to say, part of the point of the book, actually, has anybody in the audience read it? Raise your hand if you have. So, okay, not a bad number. That's pretty good. But the point of the book is not that kids today are spoiled. It's that that it was like we were teaching young people a kind of reverse CBT, like we were teaching them cognitive behavioral therapy. that we were teaching them the mental habits of anxious and depressed people. And this was going to be a disaster for free speech on campus, but also a disaster for the mental health of the young people who believe it. If you believe that you're fragile, if you believe you'll be permanently injured by words, that is a horrible thing to tell somebody, because it's just not true unless you believe it's true. And so that was, so I wanted to call it disempowered, because I felt like we were disempowering all of these young people. But anyway, you had a question?
No, that's really interesting. I guess I'd love to know what you think has gotten worse since you published the book, and if there's anything you said then that you would frame differently now, either because the world has changed or because your perspective on the world has changed.
Let me think. Things have gotten worse in a lot of ways. When we wrote the original book in 2018, when it came out in 2018, there was a little bit of a worry that maybe this was just a brief sort of ideological fever on campus that might have broken by the time the book comes out. And unfortunately, it didn't. And things got much more intense on campus, particularly from about 2020 to about 2023. And then there was something that we also predicted. There was the right-wing backlash. And that's the stage that we're in right now. It used to be that we would see more threats to free speech coming from the left, although plenty from the right. And if you look at our research, we've always had that in there. But it's really been completely lopsided in the past year. Like how many attempts they come from outside politicians, for example, or from pressure from the Trump administration, oftentimes to get pro-Palestinian professors and students punished. The graph is like very little, very little, very little, and then things start going up around 2014, and then just a huge spike around 2020, and then starting to recede around 2022, and then all the way up, and that's overwhelmingly, from the right. So the atmosphere, if I were to write it again, the situation has just fundamentally changed. We're in a different era right now. But my worry is that campuses, well, I have lots of worries, that campuses, some of them are trying really hard to fix things, and others, particularly departments or cohorts of professors, think their side has done absolutely nothing wrong. It's just a conspiracy against them. None of any of this was true. And we just need to go back to where things were before Trump. And I'm always like, no, there was very serious things wrong at many schools, particularly in particular departments. Too much political homogeneity, too much certainty. All of these things that I think are toxic to the production of ideas. But at the same time, things are, so what might be called sort of I like social justice fundamentalism, instead of wokeness. I think it's a little bit, this is Tim Urban's term. I think that's still there on a lot of campuses. But on the same time, you've got professors getting in trouble for saying things that anger the right. And so it's kind of like the worst of both worlds on a lot of campuses right now.
So do you think that creates an opportunity? I mean, so there's free speech for me, but not for thee, and there's a tendency to not necessarily see the symmetry. Mm-hmm. But there's also a chance to see the multifaceted dimensions of the challenge and potentially recommit to a conception of, rigorous engagement across our differences and an interest in creating spaces for debate and discussion and a recognition that we might not know, that the views that we hold deeply might be flawed or imperfect or wrong, and the way to test them is partly against and with competing ideas. Is there any hope there? Or?
I do see hope. Some of the schools that I feel like are trying, really hard to improve things. Now, first of all, for a long time, I didn't see any hope really in the Ivy League. But there's one exception, is I feel like Dartmouth is trying really hard. Cyan Blaylock has been trying really hard to introduce more what I call structured friction into discussion. Some of the models, they have a very effective style of having teachers who actually disagree on political topics, teaching some of the same classes, which I think is a very smart way to do it. It undermines that certainty that can make you much more, that certainty that makes you sure that you have nothing to learn from someone who disagrees with you is toxic to an intellectual environment. So I think Dartmouth is doing a lot. Even Harvard, who we've been very hard on over the years, and rightfully so, has been doing important steps, like, for example, and I said this in my first book, On Learning Liberty, that came out in 2012. I think that campuses ideally should be focusing on people to try to find if they have a scholarly mindset. Now, a scholarly mindset is one that takes seriously all the time that they might be wrong. Not saying necessarily that all scholars always have scholarly mindsets, but I'm saying that it's a very healthy way to look at the world. That if someone can actually present an argument that says, you might have been wrong about the following things, your inclination is to hear them out and go, huh, look at that. I might have been wrong. I think instead, a lot of schools have been focusing on admitting people who already were committed activists. And I defend activists. I worked at the ACLU. I've got no problem defending activists. But an activist mindset is a certainty mindset. It basically means I think the following things are beyond debate. I think these issues are things that I'm so confident that I'm going to demand, and this is not all activists, of course, but I'm going to demand that that person doesn't even speak here, and if they do speak here, I'm going to shout them down. That's a mindset that if you want to have a healthier intellectual environment, you have to get away from. So the fact that Harvard moved towards essays that emphasize when was the last time you knew you were wrong? When was the last time you discovered you constructively had a disagreement? I think that's great progress. And some of the stuff that you guys are doing at University of Wisconsin, I think, is showing some real smart signs of intellectual health.
Yeah, we've had increasing student interest in our deliberation dinners. I just attended the last one of the year a couple of days ago, and it was a remarkable conversation and engagement where when the students reflected on their experience, at least the students that I was listening in with talked about how they'd learned about the value of learning from each other, even separate from the particulars. It was quite inspiring. But we still got an F from you guys on free speech. We moved up 126 spots from the previous year, and we still got an F. And I've really tried to make this something I care about, so that was kind of a bummer. Help me understand how an institutional leader should think about that. I'm not saying there's not more work to do here. Yeah. There is. But I also think we were doing a lot of work, and I don't want to be coddled or disempowered. Yeah. But an F?
Yeah. Well, this is the first year we did a letter grade. And previously we just did rankings. And so we'd have we rank about 250 top colleges. And 260 about now. And we include in that the largest survey of student opinion ever done. And we have the largest database of attempts to get professors punished for speech, students punished for speech, deplatforming, which includes shout downs, but also attempts from off campus to get people talks canceled, and the biggest database of speech codes. But we ran into this problem that people would be like, hey, I'm 40 out of 250, I'm great. And it's like, yeah, but you still have 40% of your students saying that violence can be okay in some circumstances in response to speech. And you can do better. Right. So this is our way of saying, every school in the country practically can do better. I think the number one school, Claremont McKenna, this year, I think they got a B, and everything below that was a C. So we're grading on a
no grade inflation
scale.
Here.
Yeah. But at the same time, 70% of students say that shout downs, and I think Wisconsin is better on some of this stuff, which is one of the reasons why you're not, at the bottom of the list. But the
it was a good F.
Yeah. Harvard, by the way, got the first and second negative scores in fire arts history. So when they would complain about how they did, I'd just be like, well, let's take a look. Oberlin. For example, whereas about a third of students at other schools say that at least in some circumstances you can actually respond to speech with violence, which is very bad. It's almost 50% of students at Oberlin think that. So I think that we're pushing for things to be better. Now, do we revisit it every year? And
understand.
might we decide that some of the places that we called Fs should actually be Ds? Yes, absolutely. And we did talk today about some of the incidents, about some of the nitty-gritty of some of the incidents, which we're going to look at again,
Yeah.
because we do try to be as fair and rigorous about this as possible, because I take my rigor quite seriously.
No, I appreciate that. We had a really good conversation over lunch about some of this because we were dinged for one instance where we had a talk, maybe some of you were even there, with the former ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, and she was disrupted by a small group of people who turned out not to be affiliates of ours, but that's neither here nor there. And Susan was moderating that talk, and there was a disruption. The speaker had asked, we knew there might be a disruption, and she'd asked to have the chance first to engage, which she had. That wasn't productive. And the disruptors were asked to leave and left, and the event went on. And from my perspective as chancellor, well, it would be great if everyone understood that disrupting speech you don't agree with wasn't okay. We can't control everything out in the world. And I think we handled this as well as we could have, right? And the talk went on, the event went on, people got to hear from the speaker, and so it was from where we sat, it was a success. But we were dinged by fire for it, and so I did push on why. Yeah. And I'm not going to make Greg answer that here, but he promised to look into it because he kind of agreed that on those facts,
well,
maybe we would have gotten a D.
One thing that I did go back and do was try to remember like how we decided to award points related to disruption. The worst penalty you can get for a disruption is if you have a violent disruption. Because, and this is where it's very frustrating for people involved in actually running the school, is that there are some things that administrators will oftentimes think of and might actually be beyond their control, but still indicate the environment might not be so hot, you know, for dissent and that kind of stuff. So we have several levels of how much we can ding you for that. And you get -5 if it's violent. And if it's a disruption that doesn't let it go on, you get like a -3 or 4. And you guys at -2 because there was a disruption.
Right.
And you know, just like you said, ideally there would be a situation when there wasn't. Now, I push back when I talk to my research people about this, saying, well, because it wasn't actually students, and that's why the students matter, because to a degree, we're thinking, because we actually try to make this very student-facing, where essentially, like, if your grandkid or you yourself want to go to a school, am I going to show up, and is everyone going to tell me am I going to just have to keep my opinions for myself for 4 to 5 years? And so if you do have, if the school's doing everything right, you can still have an environment that's not so hot, and you may not want to go if you're a dissenting student.
Right, that's a fair point. In this instance, it happened not to be students. We also are more often than not pretty community inclusive about our events on campus. Probably some of the people in the room now are not part of, you know, students, faculty, or staff here at UW-Madison. And so I would hate to think that we would be safer on a fire, getting on our fire grades if we actually were more restrictive than more inclusive.
But let's say you had a situation where you consistently had a problem with people showing up from off campus, and like every time you did it, you know, like so it's one of those things where I can imagine a scenario where, and I mean certainly, you know, we both have a lot of experience with this San Francisco Bay Area. Like definitely you would run into, but then again you also will run into issues with your students too.
No, that's right. Anyway, these are complicated issues.
Yeah.
As a university administrator and leader, I sort of want you to be asking the question, is there anything reasonable that they could have done differently? And if the answer to that is no, be careful about dinging us for that, because it does create the incentive otherwise to actually not take risk, right?
Yeah.
And if we're trying to create an environment with free-flowing ideas across differences, we should probably sometimes take risks.
Oh, absolutely.
So that would be my ask.
Well,
think about that.
And one of the ways we try to address that in the and I get excited about methodology. I get excited about like all this kind of stuff. So I spend time talking about how we actually do the scores, not the nitty gritty of how we do each individual school. Right. So for example, one of the ways we try to capture the problem of an Oberlin, like we talked about, where the liberal students think, oh, Berlin's great. You can disagree all you want because everyone agrees, and being in that kind of bubble, it feels like free speech is great at a school where everyone agrees. But we give a lot of extra points for a school where both liberal and both conservative students, if both sides actually think you're a good environment for speech, that counts for a lot.
Right.
And that's one of the ways we try to capture, like, is there a situation where, but if you have a situation where all the liberals think it's great and none of the conservatives do, or vice versa, you get dinged, you get reduced points for that. So we do think really hard on how to capture it, but we also do take feedback. So we got a lot of feedback from the president of Vanderbilt last year, and he made some pretty good points. And so we tried to tweak it, but it's still essentially the system that we used about 2 years ago, but we're always trying to improve it.
That's great. Now, you and I think, agree that the heckler's veto isn't free speech, or it's not a protected form of speech, or it shouldn't be.
Everyone know what the heckler's veto is?
So say more.
Okay. So the heckler's veto is the idea, and it's just kind of like it sounds. Now, sometimes like people will get very sort of technical about it, like in the law, like what it actually means. But as far as the heckler's veto is in kind of a colloquial terms, which I think is the correct way to explain it, is you can't create a situation, and there's a great case that says this, is we believe in free speech, but not for free speech that is unpopular with bottle throwers. That essentially you can't incentivize a situation where students acting violently, or for that matter, just illiberally, like shouting down a speaker, are saying like, listen, we can't shut this jerk down, but you can, is one of those things where you have to take a stand against that, or else it will happen all the time. And unfortunately, on some of these campuses, it does happen quite frequently, that you do have student groups that will show up and shout speakers down. And the thing I always have to explain, and sometimes you'll get this, and in my opinion, kind of like naive argument, that that's free speech. That essentially, I just showed up and all I did was talk, and all we did was talk, so that's got to be protected, right? And it's like, no, you showed up and decided that because I don't like this speaker, none of you can hear this speaker. I'm deciding for each and every one of you who you are allowed to hear. That's an authoritarian impulse. That's something that's illiberal. That is something that is not okay. And frankly, it's one of the oldest forms of censorship that exists. So like, how often we have to explain this problem, and that students who actually engage in some of these shout downs should be punished, in our opinion, because they're deciding for everyone else who they can hear. But particularly if they engage in violence. And I've been very clear about this. Like the distinction between speech and violence is something that we take very seriously. But when someone gets punished for actually engaging in violence, vandalism, all this kind of stuff, that's, as long as they have due process, the school's fully within their power to do that.
But even when it isn't violent, I mean, time, place, and we need to have robust protection of free speech.
Yep.
But time, place, and manner restrictions on free speech, if reasonable, are part of a free speech regime, because those create the underlying structural circumstances that protect speech. And so the heckler's veto, I mean, right now we're having this conversation, you're here to hear this conversation. If somebody stood up and began to shout you down so that nobody could hear your points, this is a space where we're not going to permit that. If we had a different kind of debate that was intended to be go after each other verbally, then that might be allowed, right? And having those, some in our community think that having time, place, and manner restrictions on speech means that we're not respecting free speech.
Yeah, and time, place, and manner, I mean, there's a great quote called Ward versus Rock Against Racism, great title. And basically, in this case, it was about whether or not a band shell in New York City could have any limit on how many decibels they could play past a certain hour at night. So like basically like, and so they decided to sue over this, which I'm a little like, okay, good luck with that. Because the argument was essentially, having a band shell that people can hear blaring music in New York City at 4 a.m. is something that we can say, no, you can't do that, not because we don't like your viewpoint, but because it's a time, place, and manner restriction, something that just kind of makes a certain amount of common sense. And that's, so when we've seen cases where, particularly when students, and this happened at Columbia as well, like, and at Yale, when students like take over the library, for example, It's like, no, we can't take over the library. People are actually trying to study in there. So, I mean, I do actually think First Amendment law makes a lot more sense and has a lot more common sense embedded in it than sometimes people give it credit for. It accounts for a lot of these very sensible things. And if someone stands up and starts booing, can you ask them to leave? Absolutely. That's just, and I feel like the same students who would say we have a free speech right to just shout this speaker down would immediately understand it if it was a speaker they wanted to hear.
Right. Back to the free speech for me, but not for thee.
Yep.
So I'm going to start asking some questions that we got from pre-submitted audience questions, and then in a few minutes, if you've got a question you want to write down on a note card, you can begin to think about doing that, and we'll take a few of those as well. First, I want to ask about social media and the effects of social media on free speech.
Yep.
One audience question pointed out that students and faculty sometimes feel afraid of being recorded or canceled on social media for what they said in class.
Yeah.
So there might be chilling effects from the kind of democratization of information exchange.
Yeah.
And social media has a lot of misinformation. How do we think about the impact of social media on this whole ecosystem?
Yeah, social media, my biggest concern right now are attempts by the government to sort of commandeer social media. So like right now, I'm the most concerned about, I keep on saying that I haven't said this word for most of my career, but right now, given the global situation for free speech and technology, I'm worried about tyranny. Like if you can actually have government controlling AI, for example, or social media, like that gives government way too much power. But that's not to say that we don't think, so we're very purist on the First Amendment bright line between government may not control our channels of communication. So much so that like the FCC, I think, should be wildly restricted in its powers right now because Brendan Carr has been abusing this institution under the Trump administration like crazy. But when it comes to social media, it's not to say that I don't think it comes with any downsides. It surely does. But every mass communication technology, and sometimes I wish the techno-optimists would just take this for granted, it's gonna come with downsides. It's absolutely going to come with downsides. And one thing I don't think we've appreciated sufficiently on campus, and for that matter, and I'll say this about First Amendment community as well, is that you can chill speech through social sanction. That you can actually create a situation where nobody wants to say what they really think or dissent or disagree or play this incredibly important role for knowledge creation, devil's advocacy and thought experimentation. You have to take seriously that maybe like the worst counterexample of why you think something's true might actually be the one that's true, and it's a good idea to experiment through that. Now, I think that, but those are habits of free speech culture. So I wrote a book called Canceling of the American Mind, which is my follow-up to Coddling the American Mind. I woke up with this brilliant Gen Z young woman, and there we talk a lot about free speech culture versus sort of cancel culture, and we talk about it from the right and from the left. And I do think that there are ways, one, to have better cultural norms around this stuff. But I also think that we should be experimenting a lot in different models of social media that are better environments for dissent. And I think one of the models that I've seen, if you want to develop models for truth-seeking, like a social media for truth-seeking is kind of a crazy idea, but I think it can be done. But I think that one thing I've seen a lot of people come to is that you should have a reputation stake in that community, like in the sense you can only have one account and that you should be concerned about what your reputation is within that community, particularly if you're credible or show high integrity. But having some amount of anonymity at the same time is actually very helpful too, so you're not constantly wondering, is this gonna make the next time you're at a dinner party awful, or does it mean you're never going to date again, or all of this kind of stuff. So I do think that there are better ways to address social media, but every time there's a mass communication technology, the printing press most of all, it's highly disruptive. It comes with a lot of plus side over the long term, but on the short term, it's not without its downsides as well.
So, I mean, I want to come back to the tyranny point a little bit and AI, because you've been thinking about that a lot, and
Yeah.
I think we'd benefit from hearing that. But first, to sort of stay with campuses for a minute. I mean,
Sure.
There's a couple of phenomena about this. I mean, there are students who say that, in fact, surveys also show that students report that their that they feel chilled by anxiety of the social consequences more
Than everything else. Yeah.
So, people complain about the phenomenon, the alleged phenomenon, which is probably sometimes accurate, of faculty bringing their biases to the classroom. But that students actually report that they're more anxious about each other, right? And then social media makes that worse, both traditional forms of social media, but also sort of some of the platforms that exist adjacent to campuses.
Yeah.
How do we navigate that?
Yeah.
That's...
It's not easy. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I at the end of coddling, John likes to be optimistic about things, and we ended the book much more optimistically than I wanted to end it, because I actually thought things were all going to get worse, and I think so did John. But at the same time, it's like you got to give people some hope.
People hope, right?
Yeah. My weirdest idea for this, and both John and I agreed on this, is if there was more of an institutionalized gap year where people had more life experience before going to college. I think that would actually be very helpful. Kind of for the same reason I find schools that have more working class kids go there tend to be more sane environments for speech, is because they have more actual day-to-day interaction with people who disagree with them. It creates a healthier environment. But even allowing for greater maturity, greater real-world experience could help a lot with that. I still think schools should be from day one teaching people how to make the greatest use of free speech and creating environments where they can really exercise the values. The two most important values against dogma are humility and curiosity. Cultivate those as values and make sure that as much as schools can, that they get people to be more curious about each other, more curious about what their fellow students really think, and even if they hate what they really think, to be happy that they know what they really think, because that's a more enlightened way to go about the world. I do think we also probably need some habits of sometimes shrugging our shoulders, which I think we were better at as a society, that sometimes like that one person that you can never please, sometimes you have to be like, okay, I'm sorry, we're not going to fire this person. And I know you've been willing to do that to defend professors as well. So I think there are things that universities and particularly K through 12 can teach that could actually make these environments better. But I do think that an environment where nobody's saying what they really think is not a sustainable one. I think that this, and there's all sorts of backlash against it in unproductive ways.
So if folks have written questions down, I'm happy to take them now. And while we're collecting them, I want to come back to AI.
Yeah.
We had some audience questions about AI in advance. And I want to shape those by asking, you've talked about AI and your anxiety about authoritarianism and tyranny. Can you describe your biggest concerns there?
So, well, first of all, I think we're in a very grim global picture for free speech at the moment. I'm not saying anything about the Iran war. I always used Iran before the war broke out as one of the most nightmarish regimes for the combination of what AI plus surveillance can do, is the ability to keep track of individuals in Iran. And this is something I actually learned from Noah Harari's book, Nexus, I think it was called, about literally it empowered the Iranian government to shut off women's cars if they were seen on video on surveillance cameras not wearing their hijab correctly. Nobody else saw, just the camera saw, and they could shut it down. Now, you also have the same kind of thing going on with the social credit system in China. Really kind of like the level of tyranny that you can achieve with a combination of surveillance and AI is unprecedented. I also see some really bad thinking in the European Union and in the UK, where now thousands of people get arrested every year for speech that would be clearly protected in the United States. That's where my mother comes from, so this is particularly hard for me. And in Germany, where they brag about sending police to people's doors, and this is a real example, for calling a politician a penis. Like a childish insult, but they enter it down 60 Minutes. You can watch this yourself. They're all like, oh no, that's even worse than just saying about a regular citizen, because that undermines respect for government. I'm like, I also think sending cops to people's door could undermine respect for government. So when it comes to like the potential for AI, I think that AI is going to be, since it makes it so easy and it can be so intuitive, it's going to be the way we find out what the world actually looks like. It's the easiest way to go. You just ask it a question. You ask Claude or ChatGPT, like, what's going on? It's going to tell you. Power wants to control that. Power has always wanted the power to decide what is true, and it's been able to achieve that in situations like ancient Egypt, in situations like the Catholic Church. Power could decide what was true and be really sort of firm in applying that. It hasn't really been true since the scientific method was developed and in free and liberal societies. But if power gets its grubby mitts on control of AI, it will use it to tell you whatever's convenient for power is true is true. It will. So I have been advocating a lot for the separation of truth and power, and I could get into Foucault if you want me to, but I get really annoyed at him. And that's what scares me the most. But then when you start getting into agentic, AI, I get with this whole confrontation between Anthropic and the government over whether or not the Anthropic could be made to add code or delete code that would allow you to have Claude-powered killer robots or mass surveillance. It is scary enough on its own. But the thing that scared me the most about it is that the Trump administration, and by the way, the Biden administration threatened this as well, is they were going to use the Defense Production Act to require Anthropic to do that. And that's effectively nationalization. That's the government takeover of knowledge creation without meaningful guardrails. And so that scares me. So that's the part that scares me the most. I accept that agentic AI is going to have regulations around it, but when it comes to the knowledge creation part, I've seen attempts both on the right and the left to take that function over, and that should scare everyone who cares about a free society.
Okay, that's powerful and frightening, and there's a lot to that. We've got some fabulous questions. Mm-hmm. We only have a few minutes.
Oh, no.
So I'm hoping we can do a relative...
I'll talk less next time.
No. I'm hoping we can do a relative speed round and get to some of them because we've really got some terrific questions. So first one from an engineering professor. How can an engineering professor support free speech in the classroom? What do you suggest?
That's a great question. How can an engineering professor support free speech in the classroom? Teaching good habits of constructive disagreement. I think that modeling constructive disagreement can be so useful, and definitely, getting your students to say, like, why would this not be true? What could prove this false? I think getting in the habit of, like, what would be the data, what would be the argument that could prove this false, even in terms of physics.
Right. You can do that even in spaces that don't.
You can do that even in spaces, yeah.
A clinical psychologist is asking about the term psychological safety and discomfort. Should we be, how do we think about fostering necessary disagreement, conflict, and collective grappling?
Yeah.
Should we care about people's psychological safety?
Well, here's the problem with the term psychological safety. And Adam Grant says this very well, famous best-selling business professor. He talks about how psychological safety isn't, do you feel comfortable? Psychological safety is, can I disagree with the boss and keep my job? Can I say things that the management doesn't like and disagree with my job? It's basically really about, can I dissent? So FIRE tries to have a lot of psychological safety. We just don't particularly like the term psychological safety because safety tends to get sort of co-opted into meaning, do I always feel comfortable? Actually, so that's why Adam Grant talks about psychological safety in many ways as being the opposite of what we mean in other environments. So I think that you should have that definition of psychological safety, which is that people know that, like, listen, hey, prof, I think you're wrong about stuff. Delivered thoughtfully is something that you want to actually encourage, as opposed to, I mean, this is something I talked about in Unlearning Liberty. There was a list of assumptions that someone had for their class. In order to take this class, you have to agree with all of these list of assumptions. And one of them was that everyone all the time is always doing the best they can, and we won't have anyone disagree with this. And I was like, you want them to agree on one of the most fundamental and hotly contested issues of moral and philosophy, which, by the way, happens to also be wrong. If you're basically saying people aren't ever selfish or never lie, I don't know what species you're talking about.
Right. All right, somebody likes our discussion of free speech, but says we haven't talked about academic freedom, and it's not quite the same thing.
Yeah.
So briefly, what's distinct about it, and how are they related?
I tend to think
that's
of
pretty
academic freedom as a smaller section underneath the giant Boolean sphere of free speech. And academic freedom, and sometimes people like Stanley Fish will point out, like the idea that, who's an author and a critic of freedom of speech itself, really, and make the point that, well, if it includes rules, then essentially it's not free speech. And of course, that's kind of incoherent. Like the First Amendment, we understand that under certain environments, you can have rules. But academic freedom is something that, for example, within your field, you have the right to dissent as a professor. Your profession has the right to check you on whether or not you're doing that well or with good professional standards. Increasingly, administrators do that, partially because in some cases departments haven't done a great job of it. In theory, students themselves should be allowed to dissent as well, to say, like, I actually think we got this wrong, as long as they can explain themselves within those rules. But those rules don't make it not dissent. Now, where it actually differs is it's more of a limited sort of dissent realm. And for example, if you teach a math class and you're always introducing things, your politics into your abstract math class, you can get dinged by someone for saying, that's not good pedagogy. Like, why are you working something into your class that has nothing to do with the class? And that's a doctrine called germaneness. So I do think academic freedom is in big trouble. I do think there's more overlap between it and free speech than I think a lot of people understand. I think that when China, for example, allows for an academic freedom zone on some of their campuses, what they're doing is essentially allow a dissent zone that's limited to certain topics. That is, in my opinion, very similar to free speech. But academic freedom right now, I think, is facing grave challenges.
There are challenges too, though, because faculty have responsibilities to their students
Yes,
and to
absolutely.
the community of engagement. So, I could belittle you on social media, and that would be protected by my First Amendment
Yes.
right. If I were your professor
Yes.
and I belittled you in class, disagreed with you, yes,
Yeah.
but belittled you, there's a limit to
Yes,
that.
absolutely.
Academic freedom doesn't protect
And we've
that, right?
seen cases, and that's a word that we've always been kind of hesitant to even say out loud too much at FIRE, is professionalism.
Right.
Because a lot of times people, when professors get in trouble, universities will argue, oh, you actually harassed that student. I'm like, no, that actually has a legal definition, and we can tell you whether or not we think that's what you actually did. If you're saying, well, that was pretty freaking unprofessional, that's a different case entirely, and that's a place that calls for some amount of judgment on whether or not you think they actually did. I've certainly seen students claim that when you see it, like, come
Right.
on.
Absolutely.
But other cases where I'm like, wow, yes, absolutely, that was unprofessional.
Okay, we have at least 3 questions that are on a similar subject.
Okay.
We have a law student expressing that they've never heard anyone openly express a conservative opinion in class, not because of any policy of the university, but because of social pressure. We have a faculty member saying, what can I do to really create a stronger environment for free speech, not just free speech, but a variety of viewpoints and dissent and civil discourse in the classroom. And we have a third question in that same space. So for those who are worried that we're not succeeding in creating environments that promote dissent, what would be your concluding advice for the community that cares about that in a collective where it's not always easy?
I think, I want to be really bold about this. I think that our truth-seeking function, which is the most important function of academia as far as I'm concerned, and I think the one that really justifies its special treatment in all sorts of ways, is best served by having more structured friction. Like systems and approaches that actually increase friction on what we think is true. And I think that, so for example, when people talk about AI routing our brains, I'm saying, well, then you're using it wrong, because you should be asking it every day what you're wrong about. So if you can't have that environment where you have 2 professors who disagree with each other, although I think more schools and more classes should, because it's powerful, you can even have AI do that to a degree. If you can make it more normal and routinized to disagree with whether you're talking about Descartes or whether you're talking about something in social science, if you can make it more routinized, if you can make it actually something that makes it feel less scary, you can actually help create that, that environment. Because a lot of cases, students don't want to go first for very understandable human reasons. They also don't want to be punished for it. And if they can see a professor actually having something play the role of devil's advocate, it conveys this idea, this psychological safety to dissent.
There are many more good questions, and sadly, no more time, but I invite you all to join us for a reception following this, and but please join me in a very warm appreciation of Greg Lukianoff in this conversation. Thank you. I think the reception will be just outside, and so feel free to discuss with each other and dissent and tell us what we've gotten wrong.
Hello,
so
I disagree.
You so much. Right. Thank you, Greg.